In the 19th century, Tsarist Russia had embarked on a policy of aggrandizement towards southeastern Europe. The lengthening shadow of the Tsarist Russian Empire on Europe was accompanied by the progressive weakening of the centuries-old Ottoman Empire as it was forced to retreat from the Balkans and the Dalmatian Peninsula. The Eastern Question essentially refers to the series of international crises generated by Ottoman decline, steady Russian advance, and the attempt of the European or the other European powers to somehow prevent the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, which would allow the Russians to move closer to the Mediterranean Sea. In order to understand the nature of the Eastern Question, one needs to look at the manner in which the Ottoman Empire came to play such a pivotal role in shaping the international relations of Europe in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire spanned over 3 continents on the Mediterranean east. To the south, it spanned across the North African coastline, touching Egypt and Libya. It spanned over Asia along the Levantine regions, including the plateau of Anatolia. And in Europe itself, it had its base in the Dalmatian Peninsula and the Balkans. The capital of such a huge, sprawling empire in the Eastern Mediterranean was in the former Byzantine Empire, imperial capital of Constantinople, which the Turks renamed Istanbul when they captured it in 1453. The Ottoman Empire was, in its true sense, a multinational empire, although the central ruling cadre remained concentrated in the Turkish dynasty, the Ottoman dynasty. Nevertheless, the various component nationalities and ethnicities of the Ottoman world came to sort of have some kind of a partnership in running of this empire, which basically meant in Africa it was the Arabs and the Berbers, in Asia the Arabs and the Turks, and in Europe it was the Balkan peoples such as the Serbs, the Croats, the Albanians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and the Greeks. Although these are terms we use today, in those days it was principally denoted by the languages they spoke. So Romanians were not a people recognized as people. They were principally people living in the principalities, for instance, of Moldavia, Wallachia, and Bessarabia. The various provinces of the Ottoman Empire were governed by the individual traditional elite of these regions. As a result, the partnership more or less flourished for a fairly long period while the Ottoman Empire was expanding. The defeat at the gates of Vienna in the 17th century marked more or less the end of the Ottoman imperial expansion. Thereafter, the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, was basically hanging on for as long as it could till it was eventually pushed out. The process of decline of the Ottoman Empire, properly speaking, began in the 18th century because of changing economic realities around the Mediterranean as commercial revolution began to push the older ways of doing business out of the market. And the Ottoman Empire, which had been for such a long time an important trading destination for European manufacture, began to shift its character. Towards the end of the 18th century, this led to a gradual disintegration, internal crumbling as it were, inside the Ottoman Empire, and was accompanied by the growing desire of Tsarist Russia to move southwards. And the basic condition of the Eastern Question emerging was primarily to do with the Ottoman attempt at stalling Russian expansion and also preventing its own disintegration. The first major reverse in the Ottoman scenario is to be noticed essentially in the year 1740, long before Russia had actually embarked south. In 1740, the Ottoman Empire, which was unable to maintain a major naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean anymore, decided to reach out to France. They signed a treaty under which France was to come forth and give it some kind of military security in the Eastern Mediterranean, in return for which France was to gain privileged commercial position in the Ottoman Empire. For all practical purposes, this was the beginning of Ottoman dependence on foreign powers, Ottoman dependence specifically on European powers for its own survival. By the second half of the 18th century, as France was going through its own period of turmoil, Russian expansion in this direction began to play a major role in precipitating Ottoman decline. The preoccupation of Russia towards, in terms of expansionism in the southeastern Europe, had roots in what the Russians would call the warm water policy. Now, Russia's vast coastline in the north had hardly any ports that would not freeze up during the winter, which basically meant during the cold Russian winter, the entire northern reaches of Russia would be out of bounds for commercial exchanges with Europe, which were crucial to the economy of the Russian Empire. So from the second half of the 18th century, as the Russian Empire began to grow more and more powerful, it began to play with this option of searching for warm water ports, that is to say, ports which would not freeze up during the winter. This could be found only to the Russian south, in the three nearest water bodies, which were the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. And from the second half of the 18th century, Russia therefore began a policy of steady expansion towards the south, vis-a-vis the Persian Empire in the Caspian Sea, and vis-a-vis the Ottomans in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. For Russia, in terms of their warm water policy, the preferred alternative was direct military conquest of the concerned regions. And Russia, in fact, embarked on such a policy of conquest vis-a-vis the Kingdom of Persia in the Caspian regions. The Ottomans, however, proved a little tricky, because repeatedly Russia had to witness European opposition, greater European opposition to Russian policy of expansionism, of Russian policy of direct control of this region. Russia's primary aim was to push the Ottomans out altogether of the Black Sea, and more particularly of their possession over the Straits of Dardanelles and Bosphorus, which connected Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. Their preferred alternative was to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. To this effect, in fact, in the second half of the 18th century, Tsarina Catherine had actually proposed to the Habsburg Emperor, who was presiding over an imperial formation that had fought the Ottomans for long, from the 17th century, if not longer. The Tsarina had actually proposed to the Habsburg Emperor that the Ottoman Empire in Europe should be divided up between Vienna and St. Petersburg. The idea of Russian presence on the Mediterranean, however, the idea of Russia's domination of the Straits of Dardanelles and Bosphorus was not a welcome suggestion, neither for the Habsburgs nor for the British, and nor indeed for the French. The Habsburgs were of the opinion if the Russians reached the Danubian principalities of the south, such as Moldavia, Wallachia, and Bessarabia, then it would be only a brief time before which Russia would advance westwards and upwards into the Danubian principalities, which were ruled by the Habsburgs. So the Habsburgs were determined to keep Russia out. Britain also was increasingly becoming alarmed at the prospect of Russian expansion into the region, because from the later half of the 18th century, Britain was developing its British Indian Empire and was unwilling to let Russia come anywhere near the Eastern Mediterranean, which was pivotal in Britain's passage to India. France was moving with a defensive impulse. They had substantial commercial presence in the Levantine region and were unwilling to see Russia probe deeper into this. So when in the 1770s a major war was fought between the Russians and the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the Ottomans were defeated, and Russia ran over the Danubian principalities of Bessarabia, Moldavia, and Wallachia. But they had to, under international pressure, leave this region. The Russians left, however, with a codicil. They signed the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarji in 1773, under the terms of which Russia secured from the Ottomans the right of the guardianship of the Orthodox Christians who lived in that region, which basically meant that if there was to be any Ottoman interference in the lives of the Orthodox Christian subjects in the region, Russia could intervene, and Russia could actually then use this as a further foray into the Ottoman Empire. Thereafter, the affairs of Europe occupied the minds of everyone as Napoleon knocked hard into the Ottoman Empire in the south in the 1790s and the early 1800s. And for a time, the Ottoman Empire was left undisturbed by Russia. It had now to look after its defense vis-a-vis France. By the second half, by the 1820s, as the Napoleonic Empire crumbled and France became a pale shadow of its former self, the Ottoman Empire, in fact, began to lean closer to a more aggressive Russia. The real problem for the Ottoman Empire in the first half of the 19th century, however, came from the Greeks. Given the progressive weakening of the Ottoman Empire, and given the changing nature of European commerce, the Greeks, who used to constitute the main frame of Ottoman commerce with Europe, began to look for their own independent space outside the Ottoman Empire, which was declining, which was stagnating. And they began to look to the West as their natural economic partners. By the 1820s, the Greek merchants were keener to move towards Europe, and they began to fund secret societies that would ultimately work for Greek independence. The most important of these societies was, for instance, the one known as Etairia Philica, which was triggered by a team of 3 Greek merchants, spreading national consciousness among the Greeks. By the early 1820s, there were a number of fanariot leaders who began to associate themselves with the Etairia Philica, and in 1822, a full-fledged demand for autonomy, independence, or at least autonomy for the Greeks within the Ottoman Empire. This, the Ottomans were determined to subdue. So Muhammad Ali Pasha from Egypt was given the brief of subduing the Greek demand for independence. Pitched battles were fought before Russia decided to intervene, claiming to defend the rights of the Orthodox Christians that the Greeks were. Using the proviso of the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarji, Russian intervention turned to be fairly decisive in the first phase of the battle. The British were alarmed at the growing Russian influence in this region, and they were afraid that this might actually mean that Russia would gain both in Constantinople, Istanbul, and in the newly emergent Greek region. So Britain also began to intervene, and so did France, to such an to such an extent that in the mid-1820s to the late 1820s, at a time when the Egyptian fleet of Muhammad Ali Pasha was almost about to subdue the entire Greek demand for independence, British and French intervention prevented a decisive Ottoman victory. This led to a period of a cooling off, as it were, but it was becoming fairly clear by 1830 that Greece was going to go a different path from the rest of the Ottoman Empire. In 1831, Russian intervention in favor of the Russian mediation in favor of the Greeks was almost about to bring the Greeks an autonomous status within the Ottoman Empire, which alarmed London and Paris. So Britain and France began to push for a demand that the Ottoman Empire should ultimately allow Greece to break away from it, and Greece was to be set up as an independent state. This was the understanding that was arrived at in 1832, and in order to make certain that the Greeks did not get the opportunity of bringing the Russians into the Balkans, it was decided that the Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria, which is a German-speaking dynasty, quite removed from the Russian sphere of influence, would provide Greece with its first king. So in 1833, when the independent state of Greece came into being, it was headed, ironically, not by a Greek, but by a German-speaking prince. So even as the Russians were being made to withdraw by Anglo-French pressure, the Ottoman Empire signed the Treaty of Unkiar-Skelessi with Russia. This was to prove a crucial development, because there were two dimensions to the Treaty of Unkiar-Skelessi. On the one hand, the Ottomans and the Russians were to enter into an offensive and defensive military alliance, which basically meant that if the Ottoman Empire was under attack from any other power, the Russians would step forth, and if the Russians were to be under attack from any other empire, the Ottomans would step forth. For the Ottomans, this was an important thing, because around this time, in the 1830s, Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt was trying to carve out his independent space by creating hereditary succession in Egypt, nominally within the Ottoman Empire, but virtually preparing for a secession. So the Ottoman Sultan was simply trying to take out a guarantee, something like an insurance from the Russians. Now, in return for giving this offensive and defensive alliance, this guarantee, the Russians demanded that the Ottoman Empire should allow the Straits of Bosphorus and Dardanelles to remain open to the Russians even in times of war. The general practice till that point of time had been that the Straits of Dardanelles and Bosphorus would remain open for all powers, but in times of war, the Ottomans used to close the straits. Russia was simply simply securing the guarantee that even in times of war, Russia would have the freedom to navigate into the Mediterranean Sea. The period between 1832 and 1852-53 was one of turbulence in the Ottoman Empire, because all through the 1830s, the Ottoman Empire had to struggle with its own protege in Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha. And there were several occasions when the differences almost came to the verge of conflict. Towards the closing years of the 1830s, in 1839 to be precise, it was the possibility of a conflict that pushed the Ottomans to seek Russian support once again. When Muhammad Ali Pasha forces of Muhammad Ali Pasha ran over Levantine Asia, the entire region between Aleppo and Damascus, and established his control, the Ottoman Sultan, in a bid to fight him back, decided to bring in Russian troops. 20,000 Russian troops were promptly dispatched to the aid of the Ottoman Sultan. Alarmed by this prospect, the British and the French intervened. They demanded of the Sultan that the Russian forces should be pushed out, or the Russian forces should be asked to withdraw. In return, they volunteered to mediate between the Ottoman Sultan and Muhammad Ali Pasha. The outcome of the resolution, the outcome of this mediation in 1840 was that Muhammad Ali Pasha was recognized as the hereditary ruler of Egypt and was also given the governorship of Syria, Aleppo and Damascus, but on the condition that these regions would continue to remain within the Ottoman Empire. The British and the French further pledged to uphold the unity and integrity of the empire. This pledge was finally formalized in the Straits Convention of 1841. Under the Straits Convention, the Ottoman Empire was made to agree to the idea that in future, in times of conflict, the Straits and Dardanelles and Bosphorus would have to be closed to all powers. Now this remained in violation to the secret provision that the Ottomans had already signed in the Treaty of Unkiar-Skelessi. The complications generated by the Straits Convention were to have momentous significance in the years that followed. In course of the 1840s, France decided to step up its diplomatic presence in this region, and particularly with the coming of Napoleon III, the French decision to increase French profile in the region began to have a more hard consequences. Napoleon III, desirous of soliciting Catholic support in the realm of his domestic arena, began to push for a change in the status of the Ottoman Empire's disposition towards the Christians. The Ottoman Empire in Levantine Asia ruled over the lands which the Christians considered holy, Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And some of the holiest churches of Christendom happened to be in Levantine Asia. When this diplomatic offensive was brought into being, the Russian Tsar was very concerned and he decided to make another push. In 1853, he is supposed to have told the British ambassador, Philip Seymour, that we have a very sick man in our hands, and unless something is done about it, he would bring all of us down with it, or words to that effect. The British ambassador is supposed to have said that the sick man actually needs a physician, not a surgeon. But this is very clearly indicative of what Tsar Nicholas was planning to do. Tsar Nicholas meant to give the Ottoman Empire a push, and when the French diplomatic offensive looked like displacing the significance of the Russians as the guardians of the Orthodox Christians, the Russians decided to go to war. When the Russian advance in this region began, the British and the French immediately decided to give the Ottomans military support, which allowed actually to push them back in 1853. Even after Russian withdrawal had been staged, Britain and France decided that the problem had to be solved for once and for all. So in 1853, Russia was asked to pull out of the Danubian provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia, and even from the province of Bessarabia, from their status of guardianship. That Russia was not to use their guardianship of the Orthodox Christians as a diplomatic counter against the Ottoman Empire. Further, several other proposals were also forwarded. It was argued that apart from her guardianship of Danubian provinces, Russia had to stop meddling unnecessarily in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire on the guise of protecting Orthodox interests. Further, it was argued that the Straits Convention of 1841 would have to be re-evaluated to consider whether the Russians would have access to the Mediterranean, even in peacetime, without consulting the other powers. And finally, it was argued the Danube had to be open to all. Now, this was a provision, the last provision Russia could live with. But the idea of re-evaluating the Straits Convention and also stop interfering in the lives of Orthodox Christians were provisions that Russia could not stomach. This led to the Crimean War, where Russia had to fight the joint forces of the British and the French, and the Austrian Empire also joined in, keen on expelling Russia from the Danubian principalities. In 1856, when the war came to a close, it framed more or less the Treaty of Paris in 1856 framed more or less the terms on which the Eastern question was to turn from this point of time. One of the most important provisions of the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Crimean War was to bring about demilitarization of the Black Sea region. That is, none of the powers were allowed to have a naval station in the Black Sea region. Since no one but for Russia had a naval presence in the region, it was basically an urging the Russians to move out of the Black Sea. The second most important provision was that the Ottomans had to reform their state structure in such a manner that Orthodox Christians would not give the Russians the pretext of returning to the region. The last provision of Russian pulling out of Danubian principalities was also indicative that in future Austria-Hungary would have a major stake in the unity and integrity of the Ottoman Empire. From this point of time, the Eastern question began to transpose itself as Balkan nationalism.